Chapter 12 of Lavender and Old Lace. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bridget. Lavender and Old Lace by Myrtle Reed. Chapter 12 Bride and Groom. Though Winfield had sternly determined to go back to town the following day, he did not achieve departure until later. Ruth went to the station with him, and desolation came upon her when the train pulled out, in spite of the new happiness in her heart. She had little time to miss him, however, for, at the end of the week, and in accordance with immemorial custom, the unexpected happened. She was sitting at her window one morning, trying to sew, when the village chariot stopped at the gate and a lady descended. Joe stirred lazily on the front seat, but she said in a clear, high pitched voice, "You needn't trouble yourself, Joe, he'll carry the things." She came toward the house, fanning herself with a certain stateliness, and carrying her handkerchief primly, by the exact centre of it. In her wake was a little old gentleman, with a huge bundle, surrounded by a shawl strap, a large valise, much the worse for wear, a telescope basket, which was expanded to its full height, and two small parcels. A cane was tucked under one arm, and an umbrella under the other. He could scarcely be seen behind the mountain of baggage. Hepsey was already at the door. "Why, Miss Hathaway!" she cried, in astonishment. "'Tain't Miss Hathaway," rejoined the visitor, with some asperity. "It's Mrs. Ball, and this is my husband. Niece Ruth, I presume," she added, as Miss Thorne appeared. "Ruth, let me introduce you to your Uncle James." The bride was of medium height and rather angular. Her eyes were small, dark, and so piercingly brilliant that they suggested jet beads. Her skin was dark, and her lips had been habitually compressed into a straight line. None the less, it was the face that Ruth had seen in the ambrotype at Miss Ainslie's, with the additional hardness that comes to those who grow old without love. Her bearing was that of a brisk, active woman, accustomed all her life to obedience and respect. Mr. Ball was 2 or 3 inches shorter than his wife, and had a white beard, irregularly streaked with brown. He was bald-headed in front, had scant reddish hair in the back, and his faded blue eyes were tearful. He had very small feet and the unmistakable gait of a sailor. Though there was no immediate resemblance, Ruth was sure that he was the man whose picture was in Aunt Jane's treasure chest in the attic. The daredevil look was gone, however, and he was merely a quiet, inoffensive old gentleman, for whom life had been none too easy. "Welcome to your new home, James," said his wife, in a crisp, businesslike tone, which but partially concealed a latent tenderness. He smiled, but made no reply. Hepsey still stood in the parlour, in wide-mouthed astonishment, and it was Ruth's good fortune to see the glance which Mrs. Ball cast upon her offending maid. There was no change of expression except in the eyes, but Hepsey instantly understood that she was out of her place, and retreated to the kitchen with a flush upon her cheeks, which was altogether foreign to Ruth's experience. "You can set here," James resumed Mrs. Ball, "until I have taken off my things." The cherries on her black straw bonnet were shaking on their stems in a way which fascinated Ruth. "I'll take my things out of the south room, Auntie," she hastened to say. "You won't neither," was the unexpected answer. "That's the spare room, and while you stay, you'll stay there." Ruth was wondering what to say to her new uncle, and sat in awkward silence as Aunt Jane ascended the stairs. Her step sounded lightly overhead, and Mr. Ball twirled his thumbs absently. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" she asked. "Yes'm, a long way." Then, seemingly for the first time, he looked at her, and a benevolent expression came upon his face. "You've got awful pretty hair, Niece Ruth," he observed admiringly. "Now, Miss Ball, she wears a false front." The lady of the house returned at this juncture, with the false front a little askew. "I was just a sayin'," Mr. Ball continued, "that our niece is a real pleasant lookin' woman." "She's your niece by marriage," his wife replied, "but she ain't no real relative." "Niece by marriage is relative enough," said Mr. Ball, "and I say she's a pleasant lookin' woman, ain't she now?" "She'll do, I reckon. She resembles her ma." Aunt Jane looked at Ruth, as if pitying the sister who had blindly followed the leadings of her heart and had died unforgiven. "Why didn't you let me know you were coming, Aunt Jane?" asked Ruth. "I've been looking for a letter every day, and I understood you weren't coming back until October." "I trust I am not unwelcome in my own house," was the somewhat frigid response. "No, indeed, Auntie. I hope you've had a pleasant time." "We've had a beautiful time, ain't we, James? We've been on our honeymoon." "Yes'm, we have been on our honeymoon, travellin' over strange lands and furrin wastes of waters. Mis' Ball was terrible seasick, comin' here." "In a way," said Aunt Jane, "we ain't completely married. We was married by a heathen priest in a heathen country, and it ain't rightfully binding, but we thought it would do until we could get back here and be married by a minister of the gospel, didn't we, James?" "It has held," he said, without emotion, "but I reckon we will have to be married proper." "Likewise I have my wedding dress," Aunt Jane went on, "what ain't never been worn. It's a beautiful dress, trimmed with pearl trimmin'." Here Ruth felt the pangs of a guilty conscience. "And I lay out to be married in it, quite private, with you and Hepsey for witnesses." "Why, it's quite a romance, isn't it, Aunty?" "'Tis in a way," interjected Mr. Ball, "and in another way it ain't." "Yes, Ruth," Aunt Jane continued, ignoring the interruption, "'tis a romance, a real romance," she repeated, with all the hard lines in her face softened. "We was engaged over 35 year. James went to sea to make a fortin, so he could give me every luxury. It's all writ out in a letter I've got upstairs. They's beautiful letters, Ruth, and it's come to me, as I've been setting here, that you might make a book out'n those letters of James. You write, don't you?" "Why, yes, Aunty, I write for the papers, but I've never done a book." "Well, you'll never write a book no earlier, and here's all the material, as you say, just a waitin' for you to copy it. I guess there's over 100 letters." "But, Aunty," objected Ruth, struggling with inward emotion, "I couldn't sign my name to it, you know, unless I had written the letters." "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't be honest," she answered, clutching at the straw. "The person who wrote the letters would be entitled to the credit and the money," she added hopefully. "Why, yes, that's right. Do you hear, James? It'll have to be your book, 'The Love Letters of a Sailor,' by James, and dedicated in the front 'To my dearly beloved wife, Jane Ball, as was Jane Hathaway.' It'll be beautiful, won't it, James?" "Yes'm, I have no doubt but what it will." "Do you remember, James, how you borrowed a chisel from the tombstone man over to the Ridge, and cut our names into endurin' granite?" "I'd forgot that. How come you to remember it?" "On account of your havin' lost the chisel, and the tombstone man a worryin' me about it to this day. I'll take you to the place. There's climbin', but it won't hurt us none, though we ain't as young as we might be. You says to me, you says, 'Jane, darlin', as long as them letters stays cut into the everlastin' rock, just so long I'll love you,' you says, and they's there still." "Well, I'm here too, ain't I?" replied Mr. Ball, seeming to detect a covert reproach. "I was allers a great hand for cuttin'." "There'll have to be a piece writ in the end, Ruth, explainin' the happy endin' of the romance. If you can't do it justice, James and me can help. James was allers a master hand at writin'. It'll have to tell how through the long years he has toiled, hopin' against hope, and for over 30 years not darin' to write a line to the object of his affections, not feelin' worthy, as you may say, and how after her waitin' faithfully at home and turning away dozens of lovers what pleaded violent like, she finally went travellin' in furrin parts and come upon her old lover a keepin' a store in a heathen land, a strugglin' to retrieve disaster after disaster at sea, and constantly withstandin' the blandishments of heathen women as endeavoured to wean him from his faith, and how, though very humble and scarcely darin' to speak, he learned that she was willin', and they come a sailin' home together and lived happily ever afterward. Ain't that as it was, James?" "Yes'm, except that there warn't no particular disaster at sea, and them heathen women didn't exert no blandishments. They was just pleasant to an old feller, bless their little hearts." By some subtle mental process, Mr. Ball became aware that he had made a mistake. "You ain't changed nothin' here, Jane," he continued, hurriedly. "There's the haircloth sofy that we used to set on Sunday evenin's after meetin', and the hair wreath with the red rose in it, made out of my hair, and the white rose made out of your grandmother's hair on your father's side, and the yeller lily made out of the hair of your Uncle Jed's youngest boy. I disremember the rest, but time was when I could say 'em all. I never see your beat for makin' hair wreaths, Jane. There ain't nothin' gone but the melodeon that you used to set by the mantel. What's come of the melodeon?" "The melodeon is set away in the attic. The mice et out the inside." "Didn't you have no cat?" "There ain't no cat, James, that could get into a melodeon through a mouse hole, more especially the big Maltese you gave me. I kept that cat, James, as you may say, all these weary years. When there was kittens, I kept the one that looked most like old Malty. But of late years the cats has all been different, and the one I buried just afore I sailed away was yeller and white with black and brown spots, a kinder tortoise shell, that didn't look nothin' like Malty. You'd never have knowed they belonged to the same family, but I was sorry when she died, on account of her bein' the last cat." Hepsey, half frightened, put her head into the room. "Dinner's ready," she shouted, hurriedly shutting the door. "Give me your arm, James," said Mrs. Ball, and Ruth followed them into the dining room. The retired sailor ate heartily, casting occasional admiring